What happened to player managers? Kenny Dalglish won 3 league titles at Liverpool during the 80s as a player coach. Glenn Hoddle played 39 times for Chelsea whilst in the dugout, but it seems like they've died a slow death. So in this video we're going to take a look at the rise and the fall of player managers. Definition, as usual, what is a player manager? Funnily enough, it's a player who is also a manager. It's normally a player who is at the end of the career, their legs might have gone a bit, and they're looking to get into coaching, so they become a manager of their current football club. It is a bit of a weird concept, isn't it? Because we normally see managers as an old wise Alex Ferguson kind of figure, or an Arsene Wenger, or a Jose Mourinho. And although it seems like managers are getting younger, Ruben Amorim is in his late 30s, Fabian Hürzeler is in his early 30s. They were both players that are retired and are just full-time managers. I mean, it even flows down to youth levels and Sunday League. I mean, you don't play open age football and are expecting your dad to also be the manager, but also starting up front for them. But it was a reality much more 20 or 30 years ago. But since 2000, there's only been 5 player managers in the Premier League era, and most notably out of those we've got Leon Britton from Swansea, who took over from Paul Clement when he got sacked, the shithouse himself at Man United when David Moyes got sacked in 2014, and the recent one was Seamus Coleman taking over from Sean Dyche for the Peterborough game in the FA Cup this season. But there's a massive common theme with all of the coaches nowadays who have become player managers, and that's they were hired on an interim basis. Everton were never going to hire Seamus Coleman for the rest of the season. They were always going to bring in a manager like a David Moyes. Yes, Ryan Giggs took over from David Moyes at Manchester United, but they were never going to sign him full time because they needed a big signing like a Louis van Gaal. And my first view on it is that it just doesn't work. Player managers, I don't understand how they can work. Managers and players are supposed to have some sort of detachment. You will listen to so many interviews on podcasts, on radios, that managers see the dressing room as the players, and they don't really go in there a lot. Maybe the coaches do, maybe the physios do, but they remove themselves and are in the office, and they're only really in there on game days. And this is because it's natural and also healthy for you to moan and vent about your workplace, isn't it? We all do it at our places of work. Footballers are no different. Guarantee 99% of footballers moan about the managers, the coaches, the club. So if your manager's right next to you, lacing up his boots for training, what are you going to do? You're never going to say anything bad about him because he's right there. Kenny Dalglish seems to be an anomaly because during the 80s, Kenny Dalglish was maybe the best player in England, and unfortunately after the Heysel disaster in 1985, Joe Fagan left Liverpool and then Kenny Dalglish went in to replace him. Dalglish, like I say, was just an all-time great. He might be Liverpool's best ever player, so he probably had that respect that a lot of other players won't have had. And also 2, in the 80s, Liverpool was so dominant that it kind of felt like a bit of a Barcelona in the 2010s. If Xavi took over from Pep when he left to Bayern Munich, he probably could have kept the train going for a few more years because it was just such a well-oiled machine. And if he didn't change anything and he just continued the philosophy, then it probably would have just continued to be successful. And that's not to take anything away from Dalglish. I think he was a brilliant manager in the 90s, won a league title with Blackburn, but it's completely different taking over from a struggling club and actually proving yourself massively as a manager. I mean, there were more in the 90s. Ruud, Gullit, Glenn Hoddle, Gianluca Vialli, they all managed Chelsea at one point, and Chelsea went in a positive direction. But again, it was only maximum over about a 3-year period. None of them ever really stayed the duration. An interesting story was with Steve Bruce on the Simon Jordan Upfront podcast, when he said Ferguson told the Man United team in the mid-90s that when they were playing Chelsea under Glenn Hoddle, if they got the first goal, then Glenn Hoddle would bring himself on and then Man United would just go dominate the team because the shape, the system would just completely fall apart because Glenn Hoddle's ego came into play and he thought he needed to come on to save the game. Sure, it's tough for players like a Glenn Hoddle and a Ruud Gullit because at one point they were probably one of the best midfielders in the world. Ruud Gullit won a Ballon d'Or. So then the fact that they're near the end of the career, but I mean, let's face it, no one wants to admit that they're regressing, that they're getting worse. So Ruud Gullit probably thought he was maybe the best player in that Chelsea team, but he was also the manager, so it's just not a good combination, is it? And it's not in every case, but it's in a lot of cases. World-class players don't make great managers. Zidane has, Pep Guardiola has, but for the most part, they don't really, do they? Thierry Henry never really made a great manager, and I've heard stories about Thierry Henry at youth academies that he would show people how to do something and then he'd be completely baffled why they can't do what he can do. If you're Ruud Gullit in the 90s for Chelsea and you're pushing for cup finals and titles in Europe, then I'm sure frustration will come out at some point where you're going, oh, I can do this, why can't you? Another reason why some player managers might have fallen off is the UEFA Pro license. That is a badge that you must have nowadays to become a professional coach, but it wasn't always like that. I believe prior to the 2000s, you didn't actually need one. I listened to an interview with Mick McCarthy when he said when he became the player manager at Millwall, he didn't have any badges at all. He just got given the job overnight, and the next day, when Bruce Rioch left, he was the player manager. Nowadays, it's nothing like that, and it's a very demanding course to do, especially if you're still playing full time. It costs about 10 grand, and I know that's a drop in the ocean for these footballers, but it's a massive commitment, and completely, if you're near the end of your career, then yeah, you probably have a lot of time to do these licenses. But again, it's just completely different to 20 or 30 years ago, where you didn't need this and you could just walk into the job like that. Responsibilities are a massive thing why I think player managers just don't exist anymore, because being a manager, you are the figurehead of that club, and clubs have turned into huge worldwide brands. You're not just the pillar of a community now, the spokesman of a community, you're the spokesman of an international company basically. Pep Guardiola is the face of Manchester City, and Manchester City are in hundreds of countries worldwide because they're one of the biggest teams in the world at the moment. So could you imagine having Pep Guardiola's responsibilities and then also playing in central midfield for them trying to win games? It would just blow your head off the amount of work that you'd have to do. I mean, Ruben Amorim at Man United struggles with media responsibilities at the moment, and he came from a top European club in Lisbon. So could you imagine if he also was starting or playing in the squad for Man United? The guy would just pass out. I think that also brings back the divide between the players and the coaches, because once you go over that line from a player to a coach, you are working more for the club instead of being one of the players. And I know both are technically employees of the club, but like Jurgen Klopp, for example, he had to answer for all the FSG nonsense during COVID. None of the players had to do that. So I'm sure there'd be a lot of balancing that most people just wouldn't really want to do. Egos as well. I mean, egos are massive in football. They're not a new thing. Egos have been in football in the 2000s, 90s, 80s, 70s, whatever. But especially nowadays, they've got massive egos. So someone like a Jadon Sancho, he didn't respect Erik ten Hag, did he? He got in massive arguments with him, and it led into a massive fallout. What if Ten Hag was a player who wasn't as good as Sancho and was also his manager? The respect would be even lower. I do think criticism is taken worse nowadays than it was previously. So naturally, if someone who's doing a worse job at you playing is going to be telling you how to play, you're just not going to listen to them, you're not going to respect them at all. And there's a good reason not to. Like I say with Liverpool and Kenny Dalglish, Kenny Dalglish is one of the best players of all time. So a lot of these players had to listen to him because he had all the fans on his side. But you also have to throw in social media, don't you? As we do in every single video, you have to consider it. Like say with the responsibilities with the managers, you put social media on top of that. It's not just regional press, nationwide press, it's the entire world piling on you. Mikel Arteta, if he was in charge of Arsenal but also was playing in central midfield, people bemoaning that he dropped Bukayo Saka but he also missed a penalty. And it's just double criticism, isn't it? Because there's always that line between the manager chooses the team but he's not playing, so in some ways he's not responsible, and the players play the way the manager wants them to play, so in a way they're not responsible. But if you're in the middle, then that is difficult area to be in. Like that Ferguson story from Steve Bruce, if Glenn Hoddle brought himself on in that game and then they lost it, I believe it was 4-0, then he'd get slaughtered nowadays. He'd need to get fired the next day because social media would have just been like, that's so egotistical to bring yourself on. There still are a few player managers nowadays. Wayne Rooney went to Derby, Vincent Kompany went to Anderlecht, but even with someone like a Kompany, he only managed 4 games in his first season and then he had to pull back and just focus on being a player. I don't think he could cope with it. I don't think he could succeed at that point. He's become a brilliant manager nowadays, but even someone like a Kompany who's just born a leader, wasn't he? He was born a captain. He couldn't succeed in his first year at Anderlecht. So never mind half the other players, and he's someone with a massive respect in the game, and I'm sure a massive respect in Belgium. I personally think it's something that football has just evolved from. I don't think it needs to be pushed back into football. I don't think it will be, but it just seems redundant, doesn't it? I think nowadays, partially with some managers who didn't play football, but gaining respect as a manager. It's also removed the point of having a player manager, hasn't it? Jose Mourinho was a translator and he became one of the best managers of all time. He didn't need that pedigree which people might have needed in the past. And also, with more stats coming into the game, analytical managers are becoming great managers nowadays, aren't they? And they never worked in the game. I don't think it's just you play and then you manage. I think there's so many more avenues around it nowadays. I think it's a good stopgap for the time being, because if you've sacked a manager and you're in March or April, then an experienced player, it might not be a bad thing for them to keep them going until the end of the season. But there's definitely a reason why we don't see it anymore, and that's because I just don't think they work. But let me know what you think. Let me know what you think of player managers. Can they work? Should they work? Are there any player managers that you like nowadays? Leave a like on the video, leave a comment and subscribe, that'd be great. Well, thanks for watching.